There are 7 invisible habits killing the spiritual life of believers right now. These patterns operate silently, beneath consciousness, draining power from those who pray, read their Bibles, and genuinely love God. The problem is not lack of faith or demonic attack. The issue is daily routines so normalized they escape detection entirely. What gets fed grows. What gets starved dies. Most believers unknowingly feed the flesh while starving the spirit, then wonder why breakthrough never comes. Romans 8:13 delivers truth that cannot be softened or spiritualized away. Those who live according to the flesh will die, but those who by the Spirit put to death the deeds of the body will live. This is not metaphor. This describes actual warfare happening in morning routines, evening habits, and everything between. The flesh never surrenders voluntarily. It only dies when systematically stripped of authority through specific, intentional practices repeated daily until transformation becomes inevitable. These 7 habits function as strategic warfare against patterns that suffocate spiritual vitality. First, daily self-denial that establishes who makes decisions. Second, fasting something every single day to break dependencies. Third, feeding the spirit before feeding the body each morning. Fourth, daily inner examination to expose what really governs choices. Fifth, choosing silence over constant noise. Sixth, immediate obedience to small convictions. Seventh, living in the light with someone who knows the real story. Practiced consistently, these patterns resurrect sensitivity to God, demolish temptation's grip, and fundamentally alter inner experience. Galatians 5:17 describes the conflict with precision that should disturb comfortable Christianity. The flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in constant warfare, preventing believers from doing what they genuinely want. Victory never comes through hoping the flesh will eventually cooperate. Triumph arrives through deliberately choosing which nature receives daily nourishment. Small choices compound into massive transformation. What seems insignificant in the moment shapes everything over time. The first habit establishes the foundation for everything else. Learning to say no represents the primary battleground where spiritual authority either gets established or surrendered permanently. The flesh does not die through prayer alone, regardless of how passionate the intercession sounds or how long the devotional time lasts. It dies when it loses the ability to dictate terms, when it realizes that comfort is no longer guaranteed, and impulse will not automatically be honored. Consider a child who never hears the word no, never experiences boundaries, never encounters limits to immediate gratification. Initially, the child influences decisions through crying or complaining. Over time, that child does not simply influence household choices. That child dominates the entire home, making everyone else adjust constantly to their demands, creating chaos that seems normal because it developed gradually. The same pattern operates spiritually with devastating precision. Small concessions to comfort accumulate into tyranny that feels impossible to break. Avoiding discomfort becomes an unbreakable habit that shapes every decision. Choosing the easy path hardens into absolute refusal of anything requiring genuine sacrifice or sustained effort. The flesh gains strength not through dramatic rebellion that believers would recognize and resist. It grows powerful through 1,000 tiny permissions granted without conscious thought, building momentum in the space between intention and action, expanding territory in the gap between what someone knows they should do and what feels easier in the moment. Matthew 16:24 cannot be relegated to historical context or spiritualized into comfortable theology. Jesus explicitly states that anyone who wants to follow him must deny themselves daily, take up their cross, and follow. This is not optional discipleship for super spiritual believers or advanced Christianity for those seeking deeper experience. This is basic entrance requirement. Self-denial is not punishment but training, not cruelty, but kindness toward future transformation. The flesh promises satisfaction through indulgence. The spirit knows freedom comes through surrender. Daily self-denial does not mean living in constant misery, rejecting all pleasure, or viewing enjoyment as inherently sinful. It means establishing who makes decisions about what gets attention, energy, and priority. The practice involves intentional discomfort, small refusals that train the will and establish boundaries the flesh learns to respect. This might mean rising when the alarm sounds instead of hitting snooze repeatedly, telling the body it does not control the schedule. It could involve finishing a conversation when the phone buzzes with notifications, refusing to let technology interrupt human connection. It might require completing a task despite the pull toward distraction and procrastination, demonstrating that commitment matters more than comfort. These small no's accumulate into spiritual strength that transforms everything. Each refusal teaches the flesh it does not have final authority. Each boundary established creates space for the spirit to grow stronger. The practice is not about earning divine approval through ascetic performance. This is about taking back territory the flesh has occupied illegally, reclaiming ground that rightfully belongs to spiritual authority. Every believer must identify their personal areas of automatic indulgence and begin saying no intentionally, consistently, until the pattern breaks and new authority establishes itself. The second habit recognizes that fasting operates as continuous mindset rather than occasional religious event. Something always competes for attention, demanding space and consciousness, pulling focus away from eternal realities toward temporary satisfaction. Imagine a radio with 20 frequencies broadcasting simultaneously. The more channels playing at once, the harder it becomes to distinguish any single message clearly. Spiritual life functions identically. Constant stimulation creates perpetual noise that drowns out the quiet voice speaking truth into darkness. Modern believers rarely fast from food while gorging continuously on digital content, entertainment, complaining, and endless distraction. The principle remains identical regardless of the substance being consumed. Fasting reveals what has been running inner life, exposing the dependencies that seem harmless until removed for even brief periods. Try abstaining from social media for 3 days and observe what surfaces in the silence. Attempt a day without complaining, and notice how often negativity shapes perspective without permission. These practices unveil the real masters of daily experience. Isaiah 58 contains God's frustration with religious fasting that misses the point entirely while maintaining impressive appearance. The people wondered why their fasting went unnoticed by heaven, why their sacrifice produced no response. God responded by exposing their self-serving motives and continued oppression of others even while abstaining from food. True fasting loosens chains of injustice, sets the oppressed free, and breaks every yoke. This suggests fasting is not about impressing God with discipline, but about breaking bondage that keeps believers trapped in patterns they cannot seem to escape through willpower alone. Before continuing, take 10 seconds to subscribe and activate notifications. This simple action ensures access to content designed to build genuine spiritual strength rather than provide religious entertainment. The enemy wants believers distracted and weakened, not equipped and dangerous. Subscription represents a small commitment to consistent spiritual nourishment, rather than sporadic inspiration that fades within hours. Daily fasting creates space for seeing clearly what remained hidden in the noise. It does not require elaborate plans or extended periods. Fast from one thing every single day. Fast from checking the phone first thing in the morning. Fast from complaining for 24 hours. Fast from defensiveness when criticized. Fast from immediate reactions when offended. Fast from the need to have the last word in every conversation. These small abstentions break the flesh's assumption that it can have everything it wants whenever it wants. They create gaps where the spirit can speak without competition. The third habit addresses the critical importance of sequence in daily spiritual formation. The first food consumed each day establishes leadership for everything that follows. Starting with physical nourishment while leaving the spirit empty creates a hierarchy that determines the day's trajectory. Consider someone who sits down to breakfast having already checked messages, scrolled news feeds, absorbed the world's anxiety, and consumed opinions from dozens of sources, all before acknowledging God's presence or seeking His perspective. The body wakes full, while the spirit remains famished, establishing flesh as primary and spirit as afterthought. Psalm 63:1 captures David's desperation for God with language typically reserved for physical necessity. He describes his soul thirsting for God in a dry and parched land where there is no water. This is not poetry crafted for religious effect. This reveals priority. David sought God before seeking anything else, understanding that spiritual hunger deserves first attention. Days beginning with this principle unfold differently than days beginning with email, social media, or immediate problem solving. The difference is not subtle, it is transformative. Application requires nothing complicated or time-intensive. Before speaking with the world, listen to God. Before consuming content, consume presence. This might involve 5 minutes of silence, reading a single psalm, or simply sitting still with intentional awareness of divine companionship. The duration matters less than the sequence. First things must come first. When spiritual feeding precedes everything else, the spirit gains rightful authority over the day ahead. When physical or digital feeding comes first, the flesh assumes control that becomes increasingly difficult to challenge as the day progresses. This practice is not about earning God's favor through early morning performance. It is about establishing internal hierarchy that reflects spiritual reality rather than cultural norms. The world teaches believers to hit the ground running, to maximize productivity, to never waste a moment. This mentality creates spiritual barrenness disguised as efficiency. The spirit does not thrive in perpetual motion. It flourishes in intentional stillness that prioritizes connection over accomplishment. The fourth habit confronts the reality that the flesh thrives in unconsciousness, preferring to operate beneath awareness where it can dictate responses without examination or challenge. The spirit grows through honesty, requiring brutal self-assessment and willingness to see things as they actually exist, rather than how they appear, or how believers wish they were. Picture a house never cleaned on the inside. The exterior might look acceptable, the lawn maintained, the facade respectable. Meanwhile, inside, neglect accumulates until the smell becomes undeniable and the decay obvious to anyone who enters. Spiritual life mirrors this exactly. Outward appearances can mask inner corruption for surprisingly long periods. Someone might attend church consistently, serve in ministry, even teach others while harboring unaddressed patterns that slowly poison everything they touch. Exaggerated reactions signal something beneath the surface demanding attention. Constant irritation reveals unresolved issues that religious activity cannot fix. Spiritual coldness indicates disconnection that attending more services will not resolve. These symptoms demand honest examination, not denial or distraction. Lamentations 3:40 issues an invitation that most believers accept superficially but resist practically. Let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord. Examination requires courage because it might reveal uncomfortable realities about who really governs daily decisions. Testing involves honest assessment of what motivates reactions, drives choices, and shapes emotional responses. This practice is not about self-condemnation that paralyzes, but about self-awareness that enables genuine change. Daily examination centers on one simple question asked at the end of each day. What moved me today? The spirit or the flesh? This inquiry cuts through religious performance to expose actual operating systems. Was peace maintained through surrender or control? Did responses reflect love or selfishness? Were decisions guided by faith or fear? Were reactions rooted in the spirit's wisdom or the flesh's reactivity? Asking this question consistently builds awareness that gradually transforms automatic patterns into conscious choices. The flesh loses ground every time it gets exposed and addressed honestly. This examination is not about achieving perfection or maintaining an impossible standard. It is about developing sensitivity to the difference between operating in the flesh versus walking in the spirit. Most believers cannot distinguish between the two because they never pause to examine their inner lives. They live reactively, responding automatically to circumstances, never questioning whether their responses align with spiritual reality or fleshly impulse. Daily examination breaks this pattern by forcing conscious awareness of what really drives behavior. The fifth habit addresses a reality that modern culture actively resists. God has not stopped speaking. Believers have simply unlearned the art of listening through constant exposure to noise that makes silence feel threatening rather than restorative. Constant noise drowns out the quiet voice that offers wisdom, direction, and comfort. Consider muddy water in a glass. While agitated, it remains cloudy and opaque, impossible to see through. Only when it stops moving does clarity emerge as sediment settles and transparency returns. Spiritual perception operates identically. Perpetual motion creates perpetual confusion. Stillness allows truth to surface and become visible. Modern culture has developed sophisticated anxiety disguised as productivity. People pride themselves on constant multitasking, simultaneous processing of multiple information streams, and resistance to any moment lacking stimulation. Silence becomes threatening rather than restorative. Quietness feels like wasted time rather than sacred opportunity. This represents spiritual tragedy. In the rush to accomplish everything, believers miss the one thing necessary. They gain the whole world of productivity while losing their souls to constant distraction. Psalm 46:10 contains a command often quoted but rarely obeyed. Be still and know that I am God. This is not suggestion or recommendation for those with extra time. This is directive for all believers. Stillness is not passivity, but practice. Knowing is not intellectual acknowledgement, but experiential reality. The verse promises that through intentional quietness, authentic knowledge of God's nature and character emerges. This cannot happen while constantly moving, consuming, performing, and producing. It requires stopping completely. Implementation requires protecting small blocks of daily quietness. No music playing in the background, no phone within reach, no performance or productivity agenda. Just presence, attention, and availability to whatever God wants to communicate. This feels uncomfortable initially because the flesh hates silence. Silence exposes what usually stays hidden beneath noise. It reveals the constant mental chatter, the unresolved tensions, the suppressed emotions, the avoided questions. But pushing through discomfort leads to the place where God speaks most clearly. The sixth habit recognizes that the flesh expands its territory when obedience gets postponed, while the spirit gains ground when response comes quickly to clear conviction. Imagine an alarm clock ignored repeatedly each morning. Initially, ignoring it requires conscious decision. Eventually, the brain learns to silence it without fully waking up. The alarm still sounds but produces no response. Spiritual sensitivity functions similarly. God speaks through small convictions, gentle nudges toward specific actions or adjustments. Delayed response trains the conscience to ignore these promptings entirely until they eventually stop coming. James 4:17 delivers a perspective that makes procrastination impossible to justify or rationalize. If anyone knows the good they ought to do and does not do it, it is sin for them. This eliminates the category of neutral delay. When conviction comes and action gets deferred, that is not wisdom or careful consideration. That is disobedience wearing a respectable mask. Small postponements regarding simple matters establish patterns that eventually affect major decisions. The person who delays obeying small convictions will inevitably delay obeying large ones. Consider the prompting to apologize that gets ignored for days or weeks. Think about the nudge to give financially that gets rationalized away through supposedly legitimate concerns. Remember the conviction to stop a particular habit that gets delayed indefinitely while waiting for better timing. These moments seem insignificant in isolation. The temptation suggests waiting for better timing, more resources, or increased clarity. But delayed obedience is simply silent disobedience dressed in reasonable language. It teaches the spirit to defer to the flesh in matters both small and large. Immediate response to conviction builds spiritual momentum that transforms everything over time. When prompting comes, action follows without negotiation or delay. This does not mean reckless behavior or impulsive decisions made without thought. It means quick obedience to clear conviction. The practice develops sensitivity that grows sharper over time. The spirit learns it can trust that convictions will be honored, so it speaks more frequently and clearly. God speaks more clearly to those who respond quickly to what they already hear. He withdraws communication from those who consistently ignore his voice. The seventh habit addresses a reality that believers instinctively resist but desperately need. The flesh craves isolation because darkness provides perfect conditions for continued dominance without challenge or accountability. The spirit flourishes in light because transparency interrupts destructive patterns before they establish deep roots. Think about mold growing in a damp, dark corner. Given proper conditions of darkness and moisture, it spreads rapidly, consuming everything nearby. Expose it to light and air, and growth stops immediately. The same principle operates spiritually with precision. Secrets maintain power only in darkness. Light destroys their grip. 1 John 1:7 establishes a non-negotiable condition for authentic fellowship with God and others. If we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus purifies us from all sin. Walking in light means living without hidden compartments, secret struggles, or areas deliberately kept from view. This is not about public confession of every thought. This is about refusing to carry battles alone that were never meant for solitary combat. The weight of carrying struggles privately crushes spiritual vitality gradually but thoroughly. Shame grows in silence. Temptation gains strength through secrecy. Patterns solidify when protected from examination. But bringing struggles into light with one safe person changes everything. Not someone who will condemn or gossip, not a relationship built on judgment, but someone who understands grace, walks their own journey honestly, and offers genuine covering rather than crushing criticism. This practice is not about control but coverage, not accountability that breeds fear, but relationship that fosters freedom. One person who knows the real story, sees the actual struggle, and continues offering both truth and grace. James 5:16 makes the connection explicit between confession and healing. Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Healing comes through honest vulnerability, not continued hiding. The verse does not say healing comes through isolated prayer or increased effort. It comes through confession in the context of safe relationship. Finding this person requires wisdom and discernment. Not everyone is safe. Not every believer understands grace well enough to handle another person's struggle without responding with condemnation. But refusing to find anyone because finding the right person is difficult perpetuates isolation the flesh uses to maintain control. The risk of vulnerability is smaller than the cost of continued isolation. Living in light with someone breaks the power of shame and strips temptation of its primary weapon. These 7 practices function together as comprehensive strategy, rather than isolated tactics. Each habit reinforces the others, creating synergy that multiplies effectiveness beyond what any single practice could achieve alone. Self-denial builds discipline that makes fasting possible. Fasting creates clarity that enables better examination. Examination reveals areas needing immediate obedience. Obedience builds trust that makes silence less threatening. Silence deepens sensitivity that makes feeding the spirit first feel natural. Living in light with someone provides accountability that supports all the other habits. Romans 12:1 presents transformation as logical response to divine mercy rather than optional upgrade for super-spiritual believers. Therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Offering the body means surrendering daily habits, routine choices, and automatic patterns to divine authority. This is where actual worship happens, in the mundane rather than the miraculous. Believers were not created to be managed by the flesh. That represents profound misalignment with divine design and original purpose. Humanity was fashioned to be led by the Spirit, responding to divine wisdom rather than carnal impulse. The invitation here is not toward perfection that nobody can achieve, but toward constancy that anybody can practice. Not guilt about past failures, but consciousness about present choices. Not shame about weakness, but intentionality about growth. Starting does not require dramatic change or complete overhaul of daily routine. It begins with selecting one habit, implementing it consistently, and watching what God awakens in response.